And so the where I come from in my parenting style, and I call it play it out parenting in my book. I literally say, like, this is a new play it out parenting style,
Oh.
that you can adopt, but it kind of meets at parents in the middle.
Welcome back to the Running Wine Mom podcast. I'm your host, Samantha Solinsky, aka the Running Wine Mom. Today we've got Dr. Kim Van Dusen on the show, licensed therapist, registered play therapist, professor, host of the Parentologist podcast, and the author of the new book, Parenting Through Play. We're talking connection over consequences, tiny playful moves that actually change behavior, how play works across ages and neurodiversity, and the real life chaos behind the expert title. Get ready for stories, practical tips you can try tonight, and a few moments of honest parenting confession from myself. Without further ado, let's welcome Dr. Van Dusen. Welcome.
Hi, thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
I am very excited. And my signature on my email is we don't stop playing because we grow old because we stop playing. So I thought this is going to be the perfect conversation
Yeah.
today for everything. But before we get into that, we start each episode with our wine, and win of the week segment. This is where we share our favorite bottle of wine, vent about something that's been bothering us, and celebrate our recent victories. So grab a glass, take a deep breath, and let's get started. So what is your drinking wine of the week?
Ooh, well, last night, my go-to for white is always a Sauvignon Blanc. So I was actually out to dinner last night
Mhm.
with a friend and I ordered a Sauvignon Blanc. They only had one by the glass on the menu. And I'm like, that's the one I want. I don't even know where it was from, but if it's from New Zealand, it's even better. That's my favorite. But my favorite bottle of wine that my husband will get me on occasion, has been my favorite for years and years, is a Robert Mondavi Pinot Noir. I don't know if you've ever had
Ooh,
it. It's a reserve bottle, but it's less than $20, usually even less than
okay.
15. So it's pretty reasonably priced, but it's so good. So if you want a good red, that's my go-to. And if not, it's always a Sauvignon Blanc.
Well, you're just like me. I'm like a Savi B from NZ is my favorite kind.
I like that. I'm going to use that.
And I love a Pinot Noir in the winter. And it's just I love. So I'll have to try that one. So, what is your complaint wine of the week?
Ooh, well, if I'm being honest, I'm right in the middle of getting my book out in the world. My pub day
Hmm.
is coming around the corner. And so it's just been just jamming left and right. My schedule's been busy and just trying to get all out there. But I feel a little in the dark sometimes. I'm on my own. I'm not having a ton of support. And so I think that's just my biggest whine is just like, I really want to get this book out into the world. I know it's going to change lives. And I just feel like there's a lot of obstacles along the way. I think people don't see the behind the scenes of what's happening when you try to launch a book.
Yeah.
So it's been a lot of work, and I just called a couple of bookstores, so excited to be like, "Are you going to carry this book?" I didn't tell them I was the author. I just said, "Do you have it scheduled to be in the bookstore on Tuesday?" And they're like, "No, we don't even have it ordered yet." And I'm like,
No.
"No!" So I'm like calling all these bookstores now, like trying to like sell them on buying the book. Because I'm like, well, if it's not in the public, then no one's gonna see it and buy it. And
Right.
so it's been hard. I'm not gonna lie. The behind the scenes is a little stressful, but I'm also excited, trying to stay present in the moment and just try to, glean onto the people that are saying yes and interviewing me like yourself and just trying to get it out there to as many parents as I can.
Yeah, it's so I mean, I have been lucky to interview so many authors, big and just starting out, and I just feel like it's such a difficult space to be in. And I love interviewing authors specifically for that, just in hopes that I can get their book, just even if it hits one extra person, like, because you guys work so hard and it's just so difficult to get it out there. So I'm not in your position, but I totally can understand what you're kind of going through.
Yeah, thank you. Especially I could like get to a top of a mountaintop and just like start sharing it with them, like just throwing them off and just having them land
Yeah,
in people's
here.
driveways. Something. I may have to
Uh,
do that.
yeah. So, well, to go in a different direction, what's your win of the week?
Well, my win of the week is honestly, I've just been doing again a lot of networking, and I've landed a couple of really great media interviews for next week on television in a couple local markets that I'm super excited
Yay.
about. And so I feel like my mantra, I guess, in life is if you don't ask, you're never going to get the yes, but you have to put yourself out
Mhm.
there and take the risk. And there's going to be a lot of no's. You are going to get rejected. I get rejected all the time. But the people that say yes, and want to interview or believe in, this book or just believe in what I have to share, I try to just focus on those. And so yeah, I have 3 local news media interviews for next week in 3 different cities, and
Cool.
they said yes, and they never would have if I didn't put myself out there and even ask. And that was my win for the week.
It is truly the most underrated thing is just asking and putting yourself out there. And again, even with the podcast that I have been like, I'm going to ask this person. I don't know if they're probably going to say no. And some do, but then when people say yes, you're like, well, it's really nice that they said yes, and they never would have said yes if you didn't ask. And if people say no, you're still in the same position that you were before they said no. There's no,
Exactly.
but
Yep.
people get caught up in they said no versus,
Yeah.
someone will say yes.
Someone will say yes. Yes.
Yes.
Exactly.
So the running wine mom, we talk a little fitness. What's your favorite way to stay active?
I love hiking. So I live in Southern California. And so, we're very lucky and weather is pretty good most of the year. So hiking's really big. I'm in Southern California. So there's a lot of trails. And I just love, the movement. I love being in fresh air, nature, just the trees. It's so therapeutic. There is an actual thing like called ecotherapy and color therapy where you look at blue and green hues and, you get your mood is better, you're more balanced, and just, your stress levels are down, your nervous system is more regulated. So there is an actual science behind it, but I love the way it feels and I love just being out in nature.
Mhm.
So we do that a lot. We have a new puppy, so I've been walking her in the neighborhood. She's 5 months now. So I put on my weighted vest and I go walking in the neighborhood on with her once or twice a day if I can. But if I have more time, definitely that, or even maybe some yoga. But I do love running. I'm just recovering from surgery. Still, I had a recent surgery lately. So once I'm back up and 100% again, I'm gonna get running because I just love the endorphins that come from a good run.
There's nothing like it. Yeah, I love hiking, love running, so I can totally relate. But so how do you think maintaining your fitness routine contributes to your mental health?
Oh, it coincides 100%. I mean, obviously as a mental health therapist, I guess it's probably cliche maybe for me to say that, but I mean, there's
Yeah.
there's research back that it does, right? And
Right.
I mean, that's the proof is in the pudding there, but it really does. Like I notice myself just in my mood, my temperament, my energy level, the way I interact with my husband, my kids, just people in general, the way I reply to emails. No, it's just I get better sleep when I get movement, when I exercise and move my body. I have better
Mhm.
sleep. I have a better mood. My cravings for different things are more tame. So let's say that I don't get movement, I don't get sleep. Those are the days I'm eating more carbs and sugars and chocolate and all the things, which they're not bad. Trust me, I
Mhm.
love a good treat. But that's when I'm just grabbing for whatever I can versus actually like prepping a meal and eating more nutritionally and more balanced and things like that. So it not only affects me in a physical way, but it also affects obviously my mental state and my emotional state. I'm much more like patience and calm, especially when it comes to the kids,
Mhm.
if I get movement during the day.
So important. And moving right into kids, we also talk a little parenthood. So tell us about your family.
So I have a husband and we actually met when we were getting our doctorates together. We both have our doctorates in psychology back in, I think our program started in 2007 and we both graduated in 2013. But yeah, we've been married since 2011, and so it's coming up on 15 years this May, actually, it's coming up soon. And and actually I was the graduate speaker at our commencement ceremony when we were, again, getting our doctorates. And I was actually pregnant with our daughter at the time. We had just been married for about 2 years at that point. And I was pregnant with her. And so that was really exciting. And I started my parenting journey in 2013. So I have a 12-year-old daughter now. And a couple years later, I had my son. So I have a little boy who's 9. And so I have a sixth grader and a third grader, and we have the new
Oh,
puppy. So yeah,
just,
it's
adding to the
lively over
chaos,
here.
right?
But it's good. I mean, we're
What do you
going
think?
into the tween years and, we're
Yeah.
still in school age, but most of the kids I see in my clinical practice and that I've worked as a therapist, as you said, a child and play therapist for almost 20 years now. And most of the kids I work with are toddlers and early elementary school. So kind
Okay.
of like the 3 to 7 is my sweet
Mhm.
spot when it comes to children from a clinical perspective. So even though my kids are getting older, I'm still staying young in that
Yeah.
space with the young ones, at least clinically.
Perfect for me to ask my questions as having a 4 and
I keep
5-year-old.
leading
So
you
this
up.
is
Like I'm like, here,
I I'm like, all right, let's get to these other questions. I got to ask you what you were least prepared for in parenthood first.
Gosh. Well, honestly, and I share this a little bit in the book too. I think no one ever taught me how hard it was going to be, or there was no book out there, I guess, or just no
Hmm.
resource out there for parents, moms specifically. I'll speak for myself on going from one child to two. And not everyone has
Hmm.
two children or even more than that. And I never had more than two. So maybe it's different when you have three, four. I have friends that have seven children. So I'm sure every experience is a little bit different. But going from that one child to two was really hard. And again, I share
Hmm.
this in the book of the moment my daughter, who was 3 at the time, she had just turned 3 when I had my son. And, I had C-section. So I was trying to recover physically from the C-section. My hormones were mentally and emotionally all over the place and physically all over the place. And my 3-year-old daughter kept asking me to play with her. And I share in the book that I didn't have the time or the energy. I had this newborn. I'm literally like feeding him in his rocking chair and she's begging me to play with her. And I kept saying no. And I felt so much guilt. I felt so much guilt and shame and that I couldn't give my 100% to her anymore because for
Hmm.
3 years, that was it. It was just me and her. And I had to share my time and share my resources. And it was really hard. I went through a really tough phase of trying to balance it all and trying to be okay with
Right.
balancing it all and not feeling guilty that I was spending more time with one or the other. And kind of opening up more love and sharing that love versus it being funneled into one child. Now it was being funneled into two. And that was a hard transition for me.
Yeah, it's interesting talking to people because some people like myself, 0 to 1 was like a huge punch in the face, and 1 to 2 I was super nervous for because a lot of people, said that was harder and it was easier for me, but so many people but then some people are the opposite where they say 0 to 1 was like super easy. It wasn't like a big change and 1 to 2 was the big change. And I'm like, you don't have more than 2, so I don't know what happens at 3.
I don't think it's worse or better. I'm not sure. I've heard both,
Yeah. Yeah, but I feel like it's split in the amount of people that, so many people. I mean, I was so scared to go from 1 to 2 because so many people were telling me how difficult it was. And I'm like, 0 to 1, literally, I almost did not survive because it was that hard for me. And then I kind of was like, oh, this wasn't as bad as I thought. But for other
Right. And
people,
you get
that
used
wasn't
to
their
it. I mean,
reality.
yeah, and life goes on and you kind of adapt. I mean, that's I think what we're good
Hmm.
at, as moms, we pivot and we adapt and it's a very fluid process and you just kind of
Right.
you kind of get used to the new normal, if you will. But I just
Hmm.
remember, just those first couple of months it being very emotional for me of just learning
Yeah.
how to do that, how to even adapt and
Right.
pivot like that.
So it's interesting to ask you this question because you have a doctorate in it, but in parenting. But what is your parenting style?
So I know this sounds silly. I know I keep going back to the book. Obviously it's top of mind, but I talk about, and I've talked about this a lot in interviews, that I feel like the way that I was raised, and my parents
Hmm.
are baby boomers, and the way I was raised, and I think a lot of us that are in around that age that were raised the same way, we're kind of raised in a household where it was very strict. It was very like, you
Hmm.
do as I say, I'm the adult, you're the child, that saying, what was it? Because I said so was kind of, what we
Hmm.
grow up kind of learning and hearing. And I think there's a lot of parents that are my age that were raised in that kind of environment, still loving, obviously, but having that type of mindset around parenting that we in a way went to the other side of the spectrum and almost rebelled a little bit of, well, I don't want to treat my child like that. I don't want to raise my child like that. I'm going to be more connecting and more loving and all of those things. And so I think that's where like the gentle kind of conscious parenting came from, where we really allowed children to have a voice, let them be seen, let them be heard, but almost to the point where it was too much. And now we're kind of trying to
Hmm.
find that middle ground because then we started finding that children were being much more entitled or kind of running the show, and their limits and boundaries were not as effective anymore, not being told as, expected as much anymore. They are effective, they just weren't being used. And so the where I come from in my parenting style, and I call it play it out parenting in my book. I literally say, like, this is a new play it out parenting style,
Oh.
that you can adopt. But it kind of meets at parents in the middle where there's
Hmm.
chapters on limit setting. There's chapters on boundary setting. There's, chapters on how to effectively give outcomes and consequences and things like that when they're needed. But that's a half the book, and the half the book, relates around play and different things like that. But it's very behaviorally based. So, you still need those things to be an effective parent, but then you also need the connection piece, the trust and the safety and that
Mhm.
foundation. So then when you do have to set a rule or ask them to comply in some way, they're more apt to do it because you've already done the road work first with the trust, the safety, the connection,
Mhm.
to begin with. So it kind of marries both and kind of meets parents in the middle.
And what's one piece of advice that you give to other parents?
Honestly, to be open to new things is
Mhm.
something that I feel like I repeat over and over again. And what I mean by that is a lot of times I work with parents and they'll say, "Oh, that won't work for me." I'll give them an intervention to try at home, and they'll just dismiss it before even trying it. "Oh, that won't work for my child." Or that's not the kind of parent I am. And that's fine. There's no perfect mold for the perfect parent or even a mold for a certain child. We're all different. And you do know your child best as the parent.
Mhm.
But I just see things for 20 years. I've, done a lot of the parenting I've done with my own children, and the clients I have, and coaching those parents is all research backed. It's all evidence based, effective, well researched ways on how to
Mhm.
parent more effectively. And so knowing that from that kind of expertise and my personal experience, again, being a mom, I said, well, just, let's do an experiment. Let's just try it. Let's just see if it works. Let's just try it for a week and see if it works until our
Mhm.
next session. And then okay, and then sometimes they'll come back, "Oh, I didn't try it," or I tried it once and it didn't work." "Okay, keep trying it. Let's do it for give it a good go for 1 week." And then they'll do it, and then they'll see the change, and they'll know that
Mhm.
it worked. And so I think if I can get parents past that barrier that they give themselves and limit themselves with, because they come to me because they want solutions. They come to me because they
Right.
want that advice, but then when I give it to them, it's like there's that pushback, of like,
Right.
they kind of dismiss it like, though, that's not going to work, or I tried it once, but so I think that's what I would hope people that read this book and hear what I have to say is just giving it an opportunity. You lose as an
Yeah.
experiment, but just try it and give it a really good go. And if it still doesn't work, then take another tool out of your toolbox. But until then,
Mhm.
try this first because this might be the answer you've been looking for. This might solve a lot of your problems and challenges that you're having. So it's just being open-minded is kind of my biggest thing that I hope parents take away from it.
All right. Well, I think that's the perfect segue to get into you. So you call yourself the parentologist. Walk us through what that means to you. How did you come up with that name? And why, you have a background in broadcast journalism and obviously play therapy. And how did that kind of lead to your whole identity?
Yeah, it's funny because I feel like I needed all those other lives that I lived for so many years before I came to where I am today. And it's funny because the people that I worked with years ago in different careers that know me and know what I do now, and they're like, "Oh, yeah, that makes sense." Or they'll say,
Mhm.
"Oh, well, that training that you had in that job helped you get to where you are today." And it's true. And I kind of needed them all to be here. And not everybody needs that, but it worked for me. So yeah, so after my bachelor's, I received my first master's in TV broadcasting and broadcast journalism, and I worked as a reporter and a producer for many years up in LA. I would interview celebrities on the red carpet. I would work for Entertainment Tonight. I would do a lot of reporting for Fox Sports Radio. And then I kind of wanted to stay in that field, but I wasn't necessarily wanted to, do the broadcasting aspect anymore. And so then I went into a sales, advertising, marketing job, corporate America, wore suits every day, had my own office, my own assistant. I would go on, business trips all the time, basically for these radio stations. So I learned a lot in the marketing sense on that way.
Mhm.
And then I decided I wanted to change careers again. And so I went back and got my doctorate in psychology and then went, down that path. And then when I finally became a mom, I knew I always wanted to kind of start my own business. I knew the two things I really wanted to get my doctorate for, obviously in inclusion of doing therapy with kids and families, but I wanted to be a professor and I wanted to be an author. And I knew that I had to get to that point educationally to have that clout behind my name to really be able to do that.
Mhm.
And so that kind of started that path. And so, that's when social media was just blooming. Like I think when I first started, Instagram may have just been out for a year. Facebook, and
Mhm.
everything was still so new. I don't even know if I think texting even on a phone was I mean, I know I
I
sound like a
understand.
dinosaur,
Yeah,
but
no, I get it.
it was new and
Yeah.
different back then. And so you needed kind of an identity. If you wanted to start your own company and be branded, you had to kind of have a name and a website and a social media
Mhm.
platform and all those things. And so I started researching. I said, okay, well, if I'm going to do this, and I wanted to do interviews and media and things like that too, and still marry those two, the
Yeah.
psychology and the broadcasting together, and kind of be like the expert that goes on parenting segments and things like that. So I researched names and so many different ones came up, like the mommy therapist and like all these different ones that I was trying to go for, Dr. Mom
Yeah.
and then yeah, right? I mean, there was all those kind of
Yeah.
ones, but they were all taken. And so somehow I found parent because I was a parent and ologist since I was in the psychologist field. And so I said, okay, parentologist. Oh, parenting expert. That makes perfect sense.
Perfect.
Typed it in. The domain was available. So I went with it and I just branded everything after that. So that's kind of how it
Oh,
was
I
born
love
and
it.
how I was able to market myself on social media by using that background, obviously the broadcasting background and then the psychology background. And that's where it was born. And that's where it's led me to today.
So fun. And you've said that play is one of the most underused parenting tool. When did you personally realize this does change the game in parenting?
I mean, I think I noticed it in my very first play therapy class that I took.
Mhm.
I personally fell in love with it after the first class. And I thought, why is this not being used more? And it's
Mhm.
funny because most of my colleagues, if not almost all of them, including my own husband, can't fathom working with kids. They just don't.
Mhm.
If they were great, they could be a great parent and still not want to clinically work with children. I get asked for referrals all the time, and they're like, "Who do you know that also does what you do?" But I don't. It's very few and far
Yeah.
between to work with kids and to also do play as their specialty.
Right.
So that being said, I just knew that it was working in the clinical sense. I mean, I saw it every
Right.
day with my clients that would work with them, and in all sorts of things, whether it was ADHD, autism, anxiety, depression, kids, their parents were going through a divorce or just going through a life transition, a new sibling, moving to a new city, a new school, you name it, I would see it. I had a child with selective mutism in one of my first years I was working, and she wouldn't talk to anyone for an entire year, not her teachers, not her friends at school, nobody. And so I worked with her in a play-based way. And I remember the principal would where I was at a school, and I remember the principal looked through the window of the door and he got upset and he called my supervisor and said, I'm not paying her just to play with this child all day. Like she needs to get some movement. Like, we need to get this child talking. I remember him being so upset that I was just quote unquote playing with her. And
Right.
I've had teachers refuse to see me because they're like, they're misbehaving in the classroom. It's a reward to come play with you. So they wouldn't even let them out of the classroom even to get their therapy for the week. Right. So it was all these obstacles. And I got that little girl to talk to me. I was the only one on the entire campus the entire year
My
to get
gosh.
and she only whispered to me, but it was such a big win for me. And I did it because I
Yeah.
connected to her through play and I
Mhm.
had that trust and that safety with her and that mutual respect. And so I really started seeing more stories like that, just over and
Mhm.
over and over again, getting through to these kids, healing their trauma, healing the things they were going through, all by using play. And then when I became a mom myself and I started noticing me just being more playful with my kids and having that more play-based mentality around parenthood and started seeing my kids behave where other parents would say, how come your kids are never tantruming? How come your kids are always listening? And they don't. I mean, they have their moments, but I think a lot less than other parents that were watching because I just approached it very differently that no other
Mhm.
parent was utilizing. So that's why I wanted to write the book, is to just get all
Yeah.
those tried and true secrets that I've had professionally and personally over the years and just give it to everyone in the most tangible, digestible way so they can implement those things in their home too.
So for the parents that are listening and they it's a kind of like the people in the schools, who they hear play therapy and they think, what, this doesn't, this isn't going to work, or I don't have time to play. I'm busy. What are we misunderstanding about what is happening during this time?
Yeah, and
Play
there's two
therapy.
Yeah, that's a great question. I get it a lot actually. And I can never force anyone to do the intervention in this book. Whether I
Mhm.
know they work or not, it's hard to convince parents how to parent sometimes. So,
Mhm.
there's that obstacle. But if they just like I said, if they just are open-minded about it, there is a mindset shift to it. And I'll share two really quick kind of stories and hope that it, answers the question. But the first one being and I share this a lot, and I mean this with, in a funny way. It's a metaphor that I use a lot about how when two dogs meet for the first time, they sniff each other to see if they like each
Mhm.
other, right? To connect, they sniff each other. So it's very sensory driven. When adults connect, they talk. Hi, how are you? What's your name? How do we get to know each other? What do we have in common? What could we, but it's all done through talking. When two kids connect at the park with their neighbors, what do they say? Can you play with me? Or knock, 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 can so and so come out and play? It's all done through play. And some of it's not even, you don't even ask that question. Sometimes they just walk up to the child next to them and just start playing, parallel playing, aside them.
Mhm.
So it's all done through play. So as absurd as it would be for a parent or for adults to think that they would meet each other by sniffing each other. Can you imagine like adults being in the wild and like sniffing each other? It's just I know the image. I'm sorry
I
I
now
made
have
everyone go
visions
there.
of it.
But it's just as absurd for parents to think that they can connect with their child through talking because play is their language. It's really how they're going to connect with them the most. And then parents will say, well, I'm tired. I don't have time for this. Play is for kids. Well, if you prioritize play first before anything else, you'll get more compliance. You'll get better behavior.
Mhm.
You'll get all those things, less power struggles, less tantrums, less defiance, all of that, less aggression and anger. And that's again proven in the research and, also, but parenting's going to be hard either way. Parenting is really hard when you're struggling with your child, they're crying, you're yelling. It's very stressful. Everyone's stress hormones are high. That's going to be hard, right? And that takes time and energy to get everyone regulated again, to, diffuse the problem, all of that. That takes a lot of time and energy. Play and peacefulness also takes a lot of time and energy, but it's a whole different
Mhm.
route to take. So, if
Mhm.
you're going to put your time and energy into parenting and doing one thing over another, do you want to do the defiance, power struggle tantrum way and the yelling and crying way? Or would you rather use the techniques that I share and maybe put a little effort into your playfulness and doing it that way? But you're going to get a lot more peacefulness out of your home and a lot more compliance along the way, too.
Yeah. And so what does play give kids emotionally that traditional discipline or talking it out sometimes can't?
Well, I think, just going back to, a lot of children don't have the speech and language skills to be able to communicate in a
Yeah.
talking way, right? Some kids are nonverbal or some kids, just get anxious around having eye contact and having long conversations,
Mhm.
talking, a 5-minute conversation to us can seem like, oh, it's a teaching moment. We're just teaching them this or that. But to them, it can feel like this excruciating lecture where they feel trapped.
Yeah.
And so two things are going to happen. They're either going to withdraw and then you're going to get mad at them because you think they're ignoring you or not listening, right? Or, they might act out and start doing something just to get in trouble, just to get away from you so they can get away from the
Yeah.
conversation. So one of those things will happen. So if you do, these things in short increments or do it through play, you can still use it as a teaching moment. But if you're doing it through play, it's almost disguised of, okay, we're playing and we're talking, or we're playing through the scenario of whatever's happening. And it's much more approachable and digestible for the children to
Mhm.
comprehend and make sense of and respond to as well.
Yeah. All right, well, let's get into the book. Parenting Through Play. It's a playful title with such a serious promise that people are coming to get advice about. What was the single idea or moment that pushed you to write this book, and what gap in parenting books did you want to fill?
Yeah, I did. Thank you. That's a great question. And I did see a gap in the parenting world and parenting books. One of the last parenting books that came out was about 20 years ago called Playful Parenting.
Okay.
If anyone's read it, it's a pretty popular book. Lawrence Cohn is the author, and it was phenomenal. It was a great book, but it was 20 years old, and I wanted to write something more modern, right? That's 2 decades that have passed, a lot of generational differences that have happened from parents from 20 years ago all the way to today. And so, and I really wanted to write it in like a very, like I said, quick, simple way, like very quick how to's of if you're dealing with tantrums and meltdowns, you can go right to that chapter and get a plethora of
Mhm.
different ideas you can try for that moment. So it's a resource you can read, from cover to cover, or you just flip to that chapter. Like I have a chapter on picky eating and what to do and how to
Hmm.
help kids through, eating challenges and trying to get them to, try new foods in a playful way. And so if you're dealing with that, you can go right to that chapter and try one thing. And if that doesn't work, go to the next intervention or whatever it is. And so I tried to write it because I felt like a lot of books. So I taught play therapy as a professor for 10 years. And the books I had in the class were great, but they were very
Hmm.
scientific, very research based. I think my students were getting a little bored. It was just kind of theoretical, a lot of case studies. And I always said, I'm never going to
Hmm.
have a case study when I write a book. I'm like, one of these days I'm going to write a book and you guys have to, buy my book as the class book. And so I think I just saw the gap teaching play therapy as a
Right.
professor. And then also like as a parent, I was seeing that gap. And so I said, I'm just going to do this. I'm just going to do it. I'm going to do it myself, make it all, evidence based, and then I do sprinkle in some heartfelt moments from my own parenting and my own clients to a certain sense, but it's written in a very, like I said, digestible way. And so when I saw those gaps, I just knew I wanted to fill them. And like I said, it's the play therapy, solution focused therapy, and positive interventions and supports. Or yes,
Hmm.
PBIS. Those three evidence based programs are really the trifecta when combined together, which has never happened before in literature. When you combine all three, is really the secret to the sauce, the secret of, not just play therapy, not just PBIS or positive behavior interventions and supports, and not just solution focused therapy, but all together really
Right.
complement each other to make this parenting style the most effective that I've never seen before.
And so many of the listeners, they're juggling multiple jobs, school runs, toddlers. How would you persuade these stressed, time poor parents to play is worth the investment? And maybe what are one or two like micro play moves that they can try quickly, like under 5 minutes?
Yeah, no, that's great. Okay, so let's do this. Okay, so one of the ones that always comes top of mind that I share with quickly, because again, it doesn't usually sometimes even take a lot of time to think of it. But one of them is I'll go back to the picky eating chapter at mealtime because that seems to be a big struggle for a lot of parents, no matter what age your kids are. And so, one quick thing I share in that book or in that chapter is instead of giving your kids a fork, if they're kind of, having some power struggles and kind of protesting at dinner time, is instead of giving them the fork, give them a pair of tongs. I get those there's like mini tongs you get at Amazon, right? And even just telling you about it, like you kind of smile and you laugh and you're like, oh, that sounds actually kind of fun. Like I would
Right.
want to eat with tongs as an adult. I think that just sounds fun.
Yeah.
And it's different. It's outside the box. It's creative and your kids will love it. And they'll actually probably be more apt to eat the meal without the protest if you give them something
Hmm.
fun like that to do. And I have a whole bunch in the book
Right.
that are similar like that, like just really quick things that you have around the house to just make it more fun when it comes to eating. Or, when it comes to cleaning up your toys, when it comes to doing chores, when it comes to having tantrums and meltdowns, or if your child's just dysregulated. And, I have that's my longest chapter of just tip after tip after tip of here, try this. I have like the lantern method. So when you read it, it makes more sense. But the tongue ones is my favorite. A tantrum one is that I use a lot is leaning into tantrums, not trying to protest it as much, but leaning
Hmm.
into it. So if your child's already activated and their nervous system is already escalated, get one of those little colorful sand timers. And again, something really inexpensive investment. If you don't have one, you can always use something at home too. You don't have to buy these things to make it effective, but have them lean into the tantrum and say, okay, you have 5 minutes. When the sand timer is done, that's when time's up and we're going to go on to the next thing, whatever it is, whether it's a transition to
Yeah.
something, leaving the park, you know, whatever it is. And so they can stomp, they can cry, they can roll on the ground as long as they're safe and the people around them are safe. It's a very strategic intervention for them to actually just say, okay, fine, have your tantrum. I'm all
Right.
for it. I'll be right here waiting for
Yeah.
you when you're done. You're not abandoning them, you're not rejecting them, and they're not getting punished for it. And then when the time's up, then you're okay. Now it's time to transition. And most kids don't even need that 5 minutes. I usually do a 5 minute timer. They need two or three because they're like, okay, I'm done. And they want to
Yeah.
move on to the next thing. So that's a fun one. Or even the other day, I'll share something my husband just did. My son was, laying on the counter and he was tired. It was a long day. He didn't want to eat his dinner. And my husband was getting a little frustrated. And instead of punishing him or shaming him for not eating or, and all the things we should go to, bribing him, all the things we try as parents, he took his hand and he put it on his back and he wound him up like a toy or like a robot. And he
That's so
wound him up and he's like,
fun.
okay, it looks like, you're out of juice. We need to put more juice into you. And he wound him up and he said, okay, now you have you're 100%, like your battery is charged. Now you can eat your dinner. And it worked. That's all he did, and that's all he said. It's just so little simple micro practices like that. Again, doesn't have to be a toy. It doesn't have to be you sitting on the floor for 30 minutes having active dialogue with your kids, which
Mhm.
I know is not preferred and not and exhausting for a lot of parents. I don't know really any parents that love doing that all the time. But it's those little shifts that you can do in the midst of what you're already doing, and just the language you use and the things that you say and do that really make that effective.
I love that. I'm gonna use that for sure. The,
Yeah,
wind
do
up.
it.
And your approach reframes discipline through connection and play, and parents, for parents who are used to the timeouts and consequences, how do you kind of explain the difference between playful structure and, permissiveness? Because I feel like that comes up a lot where people think, "Oh, well, you're just gonna be letting your kid, oh, you're gonna let your kid just do that," and they're, or so I guess that's kind of what I mean, like, how do you reframe it to be like, "No, this actually works?"
Yeah, it's hard. And like I said, that permissivist type of parenting is what I'm trying to get away from, because I feel
Mhm,
like, validating a child's emotions 100% all the time. Teach them
mhm,
validate them, teach them empathy, teach them how to do repairs because, when there is a problem that occurs and someone does get hurt, whether it's physically, emotionally, or whatever, usually repair is the best way to patch that. But that goes back to the attachment and the connection piece. And so, like I said, if you use play in the way that I'm describing in the book and you create that foundation, that safety net, if you will, with your child, then when it comes to disciplining them, they're going to be more apt to listen, follow directions, not protest as much because you already have that foundation set up
mhm,
through the playfulness, through the things I was just describing and not reacting out of anger or punishments or things like that that sometimes is our go-to because that's how again we were raised
mhm,
and that's kind of our what we have been learned and by society saying this is what works. But in the long run
right.
it can be very detrimental, and we don't need to go into that, but I talk about it in the book about chronic yelling at your children, chronic punishments do lead to a lot of mental health, anxiety and depression and flight or fight modes and things like that. So approaching it from this, but again, I have a whole section on limits, boundaries, etc. So, setting the limits and saying, your feelings are valid, but the way you're
Mhm.
behaving is not okay. That doesn't follow the rules of our home. That doesn't follow my behavior expectations, which you tell them ahead of time, and they already know they already should know
Yeah.
what they mean, and because you're very open dialogue with them on that.
Mhm.
And then but then, following through, and if you had that limit set, then you need to follow through with whatever that natural or, predetermined consequence is. I call them outcomes in the book, but, same difference. But, doing things like the do-over method I talk about in the book. So let's say your child knows they're not supposed to be running down the stairs, which we know is a safety concern, obviously, right? But kids get excited, they run. That's just what they do. Like when you ever try
Mhm.
to tell a kid not to run and then they start like kind of walking really
I
fast or
know.
skipping or, hopping because they're like, well, I'm not running.
Yeah.
So instead of, saying don't run, you say, please walk, but, changing language like that. But the do over method, they're running down the stairs and you say, hey, that's not the rule of our home. The rule in our home is for us. And you take it out of your own, emotionality. And you just base it on the rules solely. And you say, the rule in our home is to walk down the stairs. So I would love for you to go right back up the stairs and then walk down and show me how it's done. And if they
Mhm.
do it, and then that's it. There's no consequence to that. Yes, they did something wrong by running down the stairs, but they were able to stop themselves and redirect them to have that do-over. And so then you just praise them and say, "Great, thank you so much for listening
Right.
and following directions and doing it the right way. And, I'd love to see that more in the future." And then you move on, you know? So I share different things like that in the book on how you can set those limits and those boundaries with them in an effective way that doesn't shame them or blame them or, things like
Mhm.
that. Because there are going to be those moments that play doesn't fit in. That's where that other half of the book comes from where, you do need that structure set up.
And that is gonna be, we had an incident today with my son. Him and my daughter were playing, and he hit her in the face because and he has them, like, every once in a while where you can tell he gets, like, overstimulated angry, and he's almost 4, he hit her in the face. Um, so, we do play and we do timeout consequences as well. Like, obviously in that situation my husband didn't do anything play in the moment. But what would you suggest that could be like, we took his stuffies away and had him sit in timeout for that? What, I don't know if that's right or wrong.
I mean, honestly, I feel like a lot of parenting is honestly just about trial and error, of
Mhm.
what works for you, what works for your child, what works in your home based on their developmental level, their age, their temperament, all those
Mhm.
things. And so I don't actually say that what you did was wrong. I think I've done something very similar to that with my kids in the past. Because a lot of times, again, we're in that moment, we just go right to what we
Mhm.
think of. And if we second guess ourselves, later we can say, oh, I probably shouldn't have done that. Maybe I'll do differently next time. But you can't really go back. I mean, teaching
Right.
your kids that you're not perfect either and you're going to make it heated in the moment and share that on with them, I mean, is perfectly fine and even encouraged. So a couple things. One is I talk a lot in the book. I think I have a chapter called, well, I know I have a chapter called this, but I think it's called The ABCs of Behavior. And where it
Mhm.
talks about being that detective, being curious behind what the child's behavior is. And so with your son, maybe he was triggered because he was hungry, he was tired, he was overstimulated, like you said. Maybe she took a toy from him and he got upset about that, or she wasn't
Mhm.
sharing, or
Yeah.
he didn't want to share, or whatever the case was. But
Right.
figuring that out first. And then I even have a part where I talk about preventing those behaviors from happening in the first place. Because let's say
Mhm.
he's getting tired or he's hungry, like maybe removing them before those things actually happen and kind of catching them before he gets escalated
Mhm.
or before the hitting even takes place in the first place. I do have a chapter on anger and aggression, and there's lots of different tools in there and ideas of what parents can do for that chapter specifically. And then maybe using a limit setting and replacement strategy. So, saying, okay, your sister's not for hitting. Or I see you hit your sister. She took the toy away from you. I know that hurt your feelings or that made you mad. Being mad is totally okay, but hitting your sister is not okay. And really
Right.
separating those two is a boundary. And then redirecting it. And again, this is all evidence based, but redirecting it and say, okay, so if she's not hitting, what you can do is when you're mad, and you can have this in the playroom, you can have one in his bedroom, wherever you might, maybe in the car, I don't know, but have like a pillow or something nearby where he can just hit
Mhm.
that instead. Like, okay, you can't hit your sister, but you can hit this pillow. Or when you're mad, you
Mhm.
can hit your stuffed animal, even like just something that's not going to hurt him or somebody
Right.
else. And, so when he gets mad, eventually he might, and he's still on the younger side. So it's one of those things you kind of have to reteach
Yeah.
a few times before they really get it. But redirecting him and saying, and like I said, defining the difference between the feeling and the behavior, and then
Mhm.
giving him options of what he can do with his anger instead. Maybe he leaves the
Yeah.
room really quickly and screams at the top of his lungs, or whatever. I have
Yeah.
tons of ideas, but whatever is going to work for him. And reminding him, hey, when you feel your body get angry like that and you want to hit your sister, what can you do instead? And teach him that in the
Mhm.
calm moments. So when he's in that adrenaline state and he's ready to, hit her in the face, he remembers, oh, wait, when I'm angry, I'm supposed to do this instead. And
Yeah.
so you're, teaching it. So when the time actually comes, hopefully he'll remember that. And sooner than later, he won't do it again.
I hope so.
Yeah.
I know, I've tried to,
I
like,
know
what do you do
it's,
when take some breaths, leave the room, but I'm gonna maybe I'll try you can go hit your stuffy or your pillow or something that might
yeah, and
might
and
help
just
him get
say, I
it.
mean, like I said, validate his feelings because, those are them, but then they say, but you're not being safe with your hands.
Right.
So we're gonna have to
Mhm.
leave now. And so the boundary is that instead of you taking his stuff away, he needs to leave. And he might kick and scream on his way out, but he
Yeah.
needs to leave and say, you're not when you decide you can be safe with your hands, then you can go play
Mhm.
again with your sister. Oh, but
Yeah.
until then, let's have a cool down and you can sit with him and like you said, do those deep breaths or whatever it takes to regulate him again. But follow through and take him out, regulate each other, and then he can go back in for another try.
Yeah. I will take that advice.
Yeah, hopefully,
So,
yeah, see if it works. Hopefully it is.
it's
If
just
not,
I
here's the
know.
tools.
So how do play-based strategies change from toddlerhood through tween years and then to adolescence?
You know, I think it definitely obviously developmentally things change, cognitively things change,
Mhm.
and play looks different from toddlerhood to tweenhood and teenagehood. Boundaries look a lot different. I was just talking to someone the other day about how I was doing an episode on sleep training and how different even sleep is. We know when your kids are little versus your kids are older, and you still lose sleep. But when they're teens, they have a curfew and they have their own car and they're out in the world, and you're up because you're wondering when they're going to come home and if they're going to come home safely and who they're with and what they're doing. Versus when they're little and you're not sleeping for obvious reasons. So I
Right.
think, as we evolve in parenthood, so much changes. And, one question I do get asked a lot is, from toddlerhood to tweenhood or teenagehood, I have a 12-year-old now, of what does play look like at those ages or what does
Mhm.
parenting look like at those
Yeah.
ages? And it does change. However, I would like to say the constant that I see even with my own children as they grow, and I've worked with a lot of high schools and teenagers in the past and have even taught in a high school before. And so is the connection piece never goes away. The attachment piece is
Right.
always there. And playfulness can always be there, just looks different. Maybe when they're teens and
Yeah.
tweens, it's more about having, listening to music together and, or, building Legos together or, doing
Mhm.
puzzles together, playing board games or Uno or something like that versus, playing with dinosaurs and cars and trucks and toys and, dolls and things like that. So playing and getting that connection through play is no matter what, 0 to 18 and beyond is still there. And the attachment piece, they need to connect with their parents. They need to connect with their caregivers in order to have a good, positive relationship. And so, any way you can find to connect with them, no matter what age they're at, finding what they like. So, when they're little, they might like
Mhm.
trains and dinosaurs and dolls and so forth. And then as they get older, it might shift a little bit, but still hanging on to having those daily check ins with them, keeping a pulse on their mental health, the things they like, the friends they're hanging out with, their interests as they change, and genuinely being with them and just showing an interest in what,
Mhm.
what they're doing too. And just having a respect for that as well, like respecting them for the person they're turning into and say, hey, you really love art. Let's cultivate that. Let's take an art class together, something like that where it still
Right.
creates that space that you can have with just the two of you, but just looks a little different as they grow.
And then the other one I wanted to ask is about parents of neurodiverse kids. They need practical tools too. How do you adapt your play-based methods for children on the autism spectrum or kids with sensory different?
Great question. And again, not the first time I've been asked this. Actually, for the past I think I resigned about 2 years ago, but before that, I worked
Mhm.
for a center in Southern California that was specifically
Okay.
for children that were neurodiverse on the autism spectrum.
Mhm.
And so for 4 years, I worked with so many different, clients of all different ages, from the little ones, literally, I think my youngest was 3, possibly,
Okay.
all the way through in their young 20s. And a lot of the play-based strategies I use in my book, I actually would work with them as well, and a lot of them did work. Especially a lot of the kids that I worked with were nonverbal,
Mm.
or they just had very severe ADHD, so they couldn't focus very
Yeah.
easily, or well, as a comorbid diagnosis, or they didn't have the speech and language skills, and so play became very almost more vital in that neurodiverse
Mhm.
community than it did for the typical neurotypical child, because they didn't have the language skills. We a
Mhm.
lot of the kids that, I say play is their language, and it is even for typical children who don't want to talk. Like, we started our episode talking about that, how kids don't really, that's not their language to talk to parents. But when your child can't physically talk to you, it layers a whole nother level of complexity. And so play becomes vital for those neurodiverse children who don't literally physically have those language skills. And so, you might be connecting through animal sounds. I remember one client I had, she couldn't talk, but she would do animal sounds. And so her parent
Oh,
and her
fun.
would sit there on the floor. It was so beautiful, and they would sit on the floor and do animal sounds together. She would be like, okay, this is a tiger. And she would
Mhm.
roar, or this is a pig, and she would oink, or, whatever it was. And then her child, who again couldn't talk, but she would make these little, or she would go, nay, or whatever it was. And it was just so beautiful that they connected through this playful banter with each other and didn't even need words at all. And so
Mhm.
again, a lot of the things that I present in the book, a lot of the concepts and strategies I present in the book have been used in the neurodiverse community and are
Mhm.
great for neurodiverse children if there's a parent out there listening
Awesome.
that has a child on the spectrum.
Well, this conversation was just wonderful. I could just keep talking for hours, but I'll let you get back to your your life after this convo. But I'm gonna leave the listeners with one more question. So I would like you to finish this sentence. If parents understood this one thing about play, everything would shift.
I'm probably not going to say this in like one or two words. I'll do-
Okay, you can. You,
it might
it's
be like a
okay.
paragraph, not a sentence, but
No, that's all right.
but I think
Finish
if
the
they just
paragraph.
yeah, I think if they just understood that, of how well it actually works. As I talked about and you brought it at the beginning, it's such an underutilized,
Hmm.
modality that if parents really knew how it actually worked and they did read this book cover to cover and actually implement it in their
Hmm.
own home, they would see the hugest shift. they would see much better connection, much better communication, much more peacefulness, a lot less of those other things that we've talked about before, the power struggles, the tantrums, the defiance, the anger, the aggression, the yelling, the crying. They would see so much less of that. And again, we're human and we have emotions, parents and
Yeah.
kids alike. And so not every day is going to be rainbows and sunshine, and neither is a
Mhm.
play-based strategies that I share about in my book. They're meant to use them in your daily life and it will shift
Mhm.
everything. But I think being, like I said, I'm going to go back to what I said before, and just have an open mindset and being open to these strategies and using them. And just like, your eyes lit up when it works for you, mine when it works for me, and it will for them too. I was speaking at a conference a couple weeks ago, and I shared a lot of what I'm sharing today. And I had 4 or 5 moms text me that night and say, I didn't really realize how easy this was. One was saying they were trying to get their
Mhm.
child out of the shower, and the child was refusing to get out of the shower to get ready for bed. And she said normally she would have just yelled or given a consequence for not listening or whatever the case may be. But she had me in her head, and she said, she had him like roar like a tiger all the way to his bedroom. And, she's like, okay, pick an animal you want to be and let's act that out. And then you can get out of the shower and go to your room. And it worked. And she was like dumbfounded. Like, it was just like,
Mhm.
"Oh my gosh, it actually worked," and it diffused everything, and it made everything so much easier and better, and she was like, "Thank you. I just never would have thought to even try that or use that type of strategy." So I think when people read this book and they have those aha moments and they actually try these things and see them actually working in real life and how much better it's gonna make them as a parent, or, have a better, parent-child relationship, that's my hope. That's my goal, and hope that that's what they get out of it. Told you it's gonna be a paragraph.
I love it though. It's a great way to end it. I mean, that's super important. And so many of the things that you talked about, I'm going to start implementing in my life. And I haven't even, gotten through the whole book. So I know that the listeners will be able to utilize this, a lot of the things you gave in this conversation. And I'm sure I know the book will give them even more. I already know, I'm going to be texting all my friends. Get it? You'll understand. Try it.
Thank
So
you.
thank you for coming on and talking about that. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Well,
Um,
thank you for having me.
and so that'll bring us to the end of another episode of The Running Wine Mom. As always, thank you everyone for spending time with us today. And don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, and share this episode with someone who needs to hear it. You can follow me on Instagram at the running wine mom _ And where can the listeners find you and your book?
You can find the book wherever books are sold. It's on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Books a Million. It might even be in your indie bookstore. So there's lots of places to find them on my website, theparentologist.com. You can start there. And I'm most active on Instagram. So if you find me at The Parentologist, you'll see me on there, and you'll see my podcast and different things and resources as well, and different links to things. But that's where you can find me, and you can find me the most.
Awesome. And I will link all of that. Thank you again for coming on. I really appreciate it. Thank you. So, thank you so much for joining us today. Remember, you are strong, you are capable, and you are all amazing. Until next time, keep running, keep sipping, keep playing, and keep embracing the joy of motherhood. Cheers, and I'll be back next Tuesday.